Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel's show started like any other. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement as they prepared to welcome Robert Downey Jr., fresh off his latest blockbuster success, and riding high on a wave of critical acclaim that has defined his remarkable career resurgence. What nobody anticipated was that beneath the surface of Hollywood glamour, a perfect storm was brewing that would expose the darker side of late-night entertainment. The trouble began even before the cameras started rolling. Sources backstage reported an unusual tension in the air as Downey Jr. arrived for his scheduled appearance. Unlike his typical charming and relaxed demeanor during pre-show preparations, the actor appeared notably reserved, almost guarded. Makeup artists and production assistants whispered about the palpable unease that seemed to follow him through the corridors of the studio. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp tongue and willingness to push boundaries with his guests, had apparently prepared what he considered his most provocative interview questions yet. Behind closed doors, he'd been heard bragging to producers about how he planned to really get under Downey's skin and deliver television that would have everyone talking. The host's reputation for ambush-style questioning and his tendency to prioritize controversy over genuine conversation had already made several A-list celebrities hesitant to appear on his show. As the familiar opening music played and Kimmel delivered his monologue with his characteristic smirk, there were subtle signs that something was different about tonight's show. His jokes seemed more pointed, more personal, and his demeanor carried an edge that even regular viewers couldn't ignore. The studio audience, initially responsive to his humor, began to sense an underlying tension that would soon explode into full view. When it came time to introduce his guest, Kimmel's tone carried an unmistakable undercurrent of something that felt less like excitement and more like anticipation for conflict. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome someone who knows a thing or two about second chances and reinvention," he announced with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The words seemed innocent enough, but those familiar with the host's tactics recognized the setup for what it was about to become. Robert Downey Jr. emerged from backstage with his signature confidence, waving to the enthusiastic crowd and flashing the charismatic smile that had won over millions of fans worldwide. But as he approached the guest chair and shook hands with Kimmel, viewers with keen eyes noticed something crucial. The handshake lasted just a fraction too long, with both men maintaining eye contact in a way that suggested this wasn't going to be the light-hearted celebrity chat that audiences expected. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough, with standard questions about upcoming projects and casual banter about life in Hollywood. Downey Jr. displayed his usual wit and charm, deflecting questions with humor and engaging the audience with stories that had them laughing and applauding. But Kimmel's responses seemed forced, almost mechanical, as if he were simply going through the motions while waiting for his moment to strike. Then came the shift that changed everything. Without warning, Kimmel's demeanor transformed as he leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious, and his voice taking on a tone that immediately put everyone on edge. "You know, Robert," he began, his words carefully measured and deliberate, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you about for a while now, and I think our audience deserves to hear the truth." The studio fell silent as Downey Jr.'s smile faltered slightly, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. The seasoned actor, who had faced down countless interviews and public appearances throughout his career, seemed to sense that whatever was coming next would test every ounce of his composure and professionalism. What happened next would set the stage for a confrontation that nobody in that studio would ever forget. The question that shattered the facade of polite late-night television came without warning, delivered with Kimmel's trademark calculated cruelty disguised as curiosity. "Let's talk about your past, Robert. The real past. The arrests, the rehabilitation, the way you've carefully crafted this comeback narrative. Don't you think the public deserves to know how much of your redemption story is just good public relations?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the audience's collective intake of breath was audible throughout the studio. Downey Jr.'s face underwent a transformation that was both subtle and profound. The easy smile vanished, replaced by a steely gaze that those who knew him recognized as a warning sign. His fingers, which had been casually drumming on the armrest of his chair, went completely still. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you asking me, Jimmy?" Downey Jr.'s voice remained controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge that hadn't been there moments before. The seasoned actor, who had spent years learning to navigate the treacherous waters of public scrutiny, was clearly taken aback by the host's aggressive approach during what was supposed to be a promotional appearance. Kimmel, sensing he had drawn blood, pressed forward with the relentless pursuit of a predator who had found his prey's weakness. "I'm asking whether all this talk about personal growth and second chances is genuine, or if it's just another performance. After all, you're an actor. How do we know when Robert Downey Jr. is being real versus when he's playing a role?" The studio, audience initially unsure how to react, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. What had started as anticipation for entertainment was quickly morphing into something far more uncomfortable: the voyeuristic witnessing of a public ambush. Some audience members exchanged worried glances, while others leaned forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of unfolding drama. Downey Jr. sat back in his chair, his posture straightening as he seemed to make a calculated decision about how to respond. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had faced far worse adversaries than a talk show host with a microphone and an agenda. "You know, Jimmy, I came here tonight to talk about my work, about projects that employ hundreds of people and bring joy to millions of fans around the world. But it seems like you're more interested in tabloid psychology than actual conversation." The response struck a nerve with Kimmel, whose facade of professional interviewing began to crack. His laugh was forced and hollow as he waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, Robert. This is what people want to know about. The glossy magazine. Interviews where everyone asks softball questions. That's not real journalism. That's not honest." "Honest?" Downey Jr. repeated, his eyebrows raising in a way that anyone familiar with his performances would recognize as the calm before the storm. "You want to talk about honesty? Let's talk about a host who builds his career on cheap shots and gotcha moments instead of actual talent or insight. Let's talk about someone who mistakes cruelty for cleverness." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as the exchange escalated beyond the realm of typical celebrity interview banter. Kimmel's face flushed red, a clear indication that his guest had struck back harder than he had anticipated. The host's carefully maintained image as the cool, collected master of his domain was beginning to crumble in real time. "That's rich. Coming from someone who spent years making headlines for all the wrong reasons," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising slightly as his professional composure began to slip. "At least I've been consistent. I haven't had to reinvent myself after a series of very public failures." The words hit their mark, but instead of the defensive reaction Kimmel clearly expected, Downey Jr. leaned forward with a smile that was anything but friendly. "Failures? Is that what we're calling personal struggles now? Jimmy, I've made mistakes, owned them, learned from them, and built something meaningful from the wreckage. What's your excuse for being exactly the same petty, mean-spirited person you were when this show started?" The studio fell into an eerie silence as both men stared at each other across the interview desk, the pretense of entertainment completely abandoned. Production assistants in the wings exchanged panicked looks, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation continue to unfold. The live audience found themselves witnessing something unprecedented: a complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic that forms the foundation of talk show television. Kimmel's hands clenched into fists on his desk as he struggled to regain control of the situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. What he had intended as an easy target for his brand of hostile humor had transformed into a formidable opponent who was matching him, blow for blow, and the host was clearly unprepared for a guest who wouldn't simply take the abuse and smile. For the cameras, the tension reached a boiling point as both men prepared for what would become the most explosive exchange in late-night television history. What happened next would be replayed across social media platforms within minutes, dissected by entertainment journalists for weeks, and forever change how celebrity interviews are conducted on live television. Kimmel, his face now visibly flushed with anger and embarrassment, made the fatal decision to escalate beyond the point of no return. "You know what, Robert? Since we're being so honest tonight, let's talk about how you've managed to fool everyone into thinking you're some kind of hero. Iron Man? Please. You're just a guy who got lucky that Marvel decided to take a chance on damaged goods. Without that suit, you're just another Hollywood has-been with a substance abuse problem." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. The audience gasped audibly, several people covering their mouths in shock at the sheer viciousness of the attack. Even the camera operators, seasoned professionals who had seen their share of uncomfortable television moments, exchanged looks of disbelief. This had crossed every line of professional conduct and basic human decency. Downey Jr. went completely still for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the kind of controlled rage that was far more dangerous than any shouting match. "Jimmy, I want to make sure I understand what you just said. You're suggesting that my work, my craft, my contribution to projects that have brought joy to millions of people around the world is somehow invalidated by personal struggles I've been open about and overcome?" The actor's calm response seemed to unnerve Kimmel even more than an explosive outburst would have. The host, realizing he might have pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, doubled down with the desperation of someone who had bet everything on a losing hand. "I'm saying that Hollywood loves a good redemption story, even when it's manufactured. How many second chances do you get before people realize maybe the problem isn't bad luck, it's character?" The studio audience was now openly uncomfortable, with some people shifting in their seats and others looking toward the exits. The energy in the room had shifted from entertainment to something far more sinister, the witnessing of a public execution disguised as an interview. Production assistants frantically gestured to each other, clearly debating whether to intervene or let the disaster continue to unfold. Downey Jr. stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. The simple act of rising from his chair somehow made him appear taller, more imposing, and infinitely more dangerous than the man who had walked onto the stage just minutes earlier. "You want to talk about character, Jimmy? Let's talk about character. Let's talk about a man who built his entire career on punching down, on making jokes at the expense of people who are struggling, on turning human pain into punchlines for his own profit." The actor's voice began to rise, not with the hysteria of someone losing control, but with the building power of someone who had finally decided to unleash years of pent-up frustration with exactly this kind of treatment. "You sit behind this desk every night, making millions of dollars by mocking people who are going through real problems, real pain, real challenges. And you have the audacity to question my character?" Kimmel, now visibly sweating under the studio lights, attempted to regain control of the situation with a laugh that came out as more of a nervous cough. "Hey, look, this is getting a little too serious for late-night television. Maybe we should—" "No, Jimmy," Downey Jr. interrupted, his voice cutting through the host's attempt at deflection like a blade. "You started this conversation. You wanted honesty. You wanted to dig into my past, to question my integrity, to suggest that my work and my growth as a person are somehow fraudulent. So let's finish it." The actor began to pace slightly, his movement controlled but predatory, like a panther circling its prey. "You know what the difference is between you and me? I owned my mistakes, faced them, learned from them, and used them to become a better person. You've been making the same mistakes for years, hurting people for entertainment, and you've never learned anything from it. You just keep doubling down on cruelty because it's easier than developing actual talent." The words landed with devastating precision, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage on the host's carefully constructed public persona. Kimmel's face went through a series of expressions: anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been recognition of his own behavior reflected back at him in the most unflattering light possible. "I've built my career on more than just," Kimmel began, but Downey Jr. wasn't finished. "You've built your career on cheap shots and manufactured controversy," the actor continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his professional authority and personal conviction. "You mistake meanness for wit, cruelty for insight, and you hide behind the excuse of comedy to justify behavior that would get you fired from any other profession. And now, when someone finally calls you on it, you want to play victim?" The studio had become completely silent except for the sound of Downey Jr.'s voice and the barely audible hum of the television equipment. The audience sat transfixed, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. Some viewers at home were already reaching for their phones to capture and share what they were seeing unfold in real time. Kimmel, his usual arsenal of sarcastic comebacks and dismissive humor completely depleted, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation and his wounded pride. But what he said next would seal his fate and trigger the most dramatic exit in talk show history. With the desperation of a cornered animal, Kimmel made the decision that would define his career's lowest moment. Rising from his chair to match Downey Jr.'s standing position, the host's voice cracked with barely contained rage as he delivered what he thought would be his knockout punch. "You know what, Robert? At least when I screw up, I don't blame it on addiction or mental health issues. Some of us take responsibility without hiding behind excuses and sob stories." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The studio audience collectively recoiled as if they had been physically struck. Several people audibly gasped, while others covered their faces in horror at what they had just witnessed. Even the seasoned production crew, who had seen their share of uncomfortable television moments, stood frozen in shock at the sheer cruelty of the statement. Downey Jr.'s reaction was swift and final. His face transformed from controlled anger into something far more dangerous. Complete disgust mixed with the kind of cold fury that comes from crossing a line that should never be crossed. Without breaking eye contact with Kimmel, he reached up and began removing his microphone with deliberate, calculated movements. "Jimmy," he said, his voice now carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the studio lean forward to hear every word. "What you just said reveals everything anyone needs to know about who you really are as a human being. You've just mocked millions of people struggling with addiction and mental health issues. Not for comedy, not for entertainment, but out of pure, petty spite." The microphone came off with a soft click that seemed to echo throughout the silent studio. Downey Jr. held it for a moment, looking at it as if it represented everything wrong with the entertainment industry's approach to human dignity and respect. Then, with a gesture that would be replayed millions of times across social media, he gently placed it on Kimmel's desk. "I came here tonight as a professional courtesy, to promote work that employs hundreds of people and brings joy to millions of fans. Instead, I've been subjected to what can only be described as a public ambush by someone who mistakes cruelty for cleverness." The actor's voice remained steady, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "But your last comment wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on everyone who has ever struggled with addiction, depression, anxiety, or any other mental health challenge." Kimmel, realizing the magnitude of his mistake, attempted to backtrack with the frantic desperation of someone watching their career implode in real time. "Robert, wait! I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Downey Jr. interrupted, his voice cutting through the host's attempted apology like a surgical blade. "You meant every word, and that's exactly the problem. This isn't about a bad joke or a moment of poor judgment. This is about a pattern of behavior that treats human suffering as material for entertainment. The actor began to move toward the edge of the stage, his departure creating a vacuum of tension that seemed to pull all the energy out of the studio. You know what's really tragic, Jimmy? You have a platform that reaches millions of people every night. You could use that influence to build people up, to create something positive, to make the world a little bit better. Instead, you've chosen to tear people down for applause and ratings. With each step toward the exit, Downey Jr.'s words carried more weight and finality. I've spent years learning that real strength comes from lifting others up, not from putting them down. Real courage comes from facing your own demons, not from mocking other people's struggles. And real talent comes from creating something meaningful, not from destroying something beautiful. The studio audience, initially shocked into silence, began to respond with something unprecedented in talk show history: spontaneous applause for a guest who was walking out on their host. The clapping started slowly with just a few people, but quickly spread throughout the audience as more and more viewers recognized they were witnessing something historic. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and growing panic as he realized the full scope of what was happening. His show, his reputation, his carefully constructed image as the king of late-night television was crumbling before his eyes, broadcast live to millions of viewers who were now seeing him for exactly what he was. "Ladies and gentlemen," Downey Jr. said, turning to address the audience directly as he reached the exit, "you deserve better entertainment than watching someone's humanity being dissected for cheap laughs. You deserve hosts who respect their guests, their audience, and themselves enough to create something worthy of your time and attention." With those final words, Robert Downey Jr. walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to echo through the television sets of millions of viewers across the country. The camera remained fixed on Kimmel, who stood motionless behind his desk, his face a picture of a man who had just witnessed the destruction of everything he had built. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were viral across every social media platform, with hashtags trending worldwide. The overwhelming response was a mixture of shock, support for Downey Jr., and outrage at Kimmel's behavior. Entertainment journalists called it the most devastating takedown in television history, while mental health advocates praised the actor for his dignified response to such a vicious attack. By morning, the show's ratings had plummeted to historic lows. Major sponsors began pulling their advertisements, and industry insiders were openly questioning whether Kimmel's career in late-night television could survive such a public humiliation. The confrontation had exposed something ugly about the entertainment industry's treatment of human dignity, and audiences were making it clear they wanted no part of it. Robert Downey Jr., meanwhile, received an outpouring of support from colleagues, fans, and advocacy groups who recognized his courage in standing up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized or mocked for their personal struggles. The incident became a turning point in how celebrity interviews are conducted, with networks implementing new guidelines about respect and dignity. The night that was supposed to be routine promotional appearance had instead become a watershed moment that would be remembered as the evening when one man's cruelty met another man's courage, and dignity triumphed over degradation in the most public way possible.